Scott Coe. When we first met through mutual friend Constantine, I was deeply, deeply impressed and inspired by your level of curiosity and intellect. You challenged me on a lot of different ideas about how I view the world and continue to do so, which I'm grateful for. And I think it really opened up new ways for me to navigate life with a bit more awareness of the challenges that I'm facing. And also you've taught me how to misid not not misidentify, but de-identify from things like business and success and really establish myself as a sovereign being. And it's been really powerful for me, and I can see how it's impacted a lot of people through your work. Past CEO of Leadership Victoria, as a public speaker, as a social entrepreneur, where you've been creating some really beautiful spaces through your artwork in different workplaces around Australia. So it's really cool to have you here today. You've been a real role model for me in terms of how to show up as a man and as a leader. So thank you, Scott, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a really great friendship to have gotten to know you at first, and then you reached out to me almost a year ago, no, a little bit less than a year ago. And because really that's when we sort of first started to cultivate and build on our friendship. And it's been wonderful to see you also do great work in leading with heart, leading with vulnerability. And it's been great to kind of across our friendship be able to push each other and tackle some of these challenges that we want to address in the world that we see around us. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, thank you. And in that vein, what I wanted us to start with and use as a launch pad is those challenges that both of us have navigated through as men in business or leadership, and what we see out in the world as, one of the more common, limitations or challenges or adversities that a lot of men face. And something that immediately comes to mind is this notion of self-doubt, and something that both of us have experienced and I think have rallied around each other to keep ourselves uplifted and optimistic and confident in ourselves and our future. So can you perhaps share a little bit more about your experience with that and why you think so many men struggle with self-doubt?
Yeah, it's a very broad question, right? Because when we just talk about self-doubt, like what exactly does that mean? Not to be all sort of Jordan Peterson about it, but it can really be quite broad when we talk about this notion of self-doubt. And it might be actually really helpful to maybe first take a small step back. You mentioned just before that in some of the work that we've done together, one of the things that you'll often see me talk a lot about is the separation of what I call the technical system from the human system, which is the hard bits and pieces, the objective nature of what a business is versus how we think about it, right? How do we approach running the business? And I think these days it's very easy to conflate the two, because we often read all these business books and follow these influencers who talk about things like you just need to follow your passion and you need to be highly purposeful when you run your business, like your business is you. And we can understand that, right? Because in many ways, running a business or running an organization, it is a big reflection of who you are. But that's also where it can create a lot of stress on any business owner, let alone being a male business owner, right? And so one of the things that might be really helpful is to separate these two components. So when we, again, talk about just the business, a business system is, of course, a group of processes put together. We take some sort of raw material, we convert it into something of value that someone wants to buy somewhere. That's pretty straightforward. If we do that well, we make profit. Hey, presto, we keep going. And all of that is a skill that people can learn, people can master. But the person inside that, the business owner inside that, as the first time you go and do something, you're never quite sure exactly what it is that you're doing. And so there's all these challenges of, am I doing the right thing? Am I approaching this the right way? Especially if it's a business where there is a personal brand to it, which both you and I, we run businesses like this as well, where it is our face on the sign. And so it becomes very easy to then correlate the success of the business with who we are as people. And if we don't get that quite right, if we don't present the way that we think we would like to present, then that creates one point of potential self-doubt. Or then if we do put up signage, but then no one walks through the door, is it me? Am I not good enough? And so there's all these reasons why self-doubt creeps into what it means to lead a business or to run a business. To your other question then, or your other component about from a male perspective, is there any challenge there? I'm not 100% sure about this. I think men do face some particular challenges, but I just want to be careful in talking about how this shows up. I think both males, females, any non-binaries, just anybody, forget male or female, forget any of the genders. I think everyone can experience a level of self-doubt when running a business. But how it shows up, that's probably where it changes a little bit. That perhaps men approach self-doubt or overcoming stress and anxiety in different ways to, say, women, for example. So I haven't really answered your question, but I hope perhaps we've sort of separated a few little items there to sort of how we think about self-doubt in the context of business and leadership. Yeah, would love to get your thoughts from that as a starting point.
For sure. I 100% agree with you. As a creator or a personal brand, and even I guess for most businesses, the way I look at it is it's a rendering of one's own lived experience into a vehicle that can transact with the marketplace to create some form of value. And so since it's our own experiences that we are weaving together into methodologies and frameworks to help others with, if for whatever reason our messaging or our offering isn't hitting the mark, it can be easy for us to make it mean that we're somehow not good enough in some way. And that's certainly something that you've helped me with, which I spoke about earlier around de-identifying from the business. So I think it's an important point that you've raised, and I think it's easier said than done to do that. It is a living practice. And I think important for anyone listening who is either building their personal brand or thinking about it is creating a bit of healthy distance so you don't completely identify with what you're building, and acknowledging that it is one part of you, but not all of you.
Absolutely. And I think there's one really important nuance here. And this is in that systems side, right? Just the sheer technical side of things. What you're describing from a business perspective is a personal brand type business. So that means people who are coaches, speakers, facilitators, businesses where you as the individual are the person delivering the quote unquote service, right? It's a little bit different if your business was selling, say, creative mugs, because the brand is not about you, it's just around the object. And if you think about it that way, and of a business that way, that's one of the steps of creating some of that distance, right? Because in many ways, when we're thinking about ourselves as the personal brand type business, we are that mug, right?
Yeah.
We're a mug. We are a product, and we are presented in a way that people want to buy into this, whatever pain that we're solving, right? But as a personal brand type business, that's where emotions get into it, because we have to present ourselves in that authentic light, in that best possible light. And there's a lot of toing and froing because everyone's just so diverse in our experience, right? In the things that you're interested in and I'm interested in. And we don't put all of that on show in a business, but there's a thinner layer of protection because it's your name on the sign. So I just want to acknowledge that part of it, that when we're, again, talking about the separation of business versus the person, that with a business, there is still a lot of value in just thinking about it as nuts and bolts, and that we are just the creative mug that's being sold, right? But acknowledging that the creative mug being a person, that's where some of those challenges really come into it.
And what do those specific challenges look like for you? Because I know you spoke about the self-doubt piece manifests differently for everyone, regardless of gender. Perhaps, yeah, can you speak to your experience of the narrative that runs through your head that creates those feelings of self-doubt in your business and in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. So in many ways, this is a really good example that I can share on this, because I run a couple of businesses. One of my businesses is an art social enterprise called Color Space, where it's a art subscription service like Fresh Flowers for an office. We come in, we change the artwork on the walls, and all of that is sourced from local emerging artists. Now, when I created this particular business, I didn't really put myself front and center. It's not Scott's art business. And so it's easy to just manage it from a nuts and bolts, right? I'm trying to build an identity in a business where I'm not front and center of that business. My other business is more in that personal branding space. No, that's not quite right. The business is not personal branding. The business is around leadership development. It's around programs that help emerging leaders find their way in the world, right? And I do that through speaking, coaching, and leadership development facilitation. But this one does have me on the front. And what has been really challenging for me is in this type of a business, it's not a clear object that's being sold, right? It is a promise of ideas. It's a promise of if you follow some of these ideas that I have, these methodologies, these philosophies, that it can help you with solving your problems, whether it's in an organization or in business. But if people don't respond to that, then it just hits a little bit more personally, because it's like, well, maybe I'm not that smart. Maybe I'm just not that good. Maybe my ideas are pretty average. And it's really, really tricky because it's not just the idea itself. It's also how it's presented. It's also how we communicate it. And this is some of the lessons that I've had to learn over time has been, so for example, my overarching suite of IP is about how to help people get a little bit more curious. I call this the curiosity mindset. And I'm really passionate about this. I think the world needs a bit more curiosity. However, there's no group of people sitting around, no group of executive leaders sitting around saying, you know what we need? We need our staff to go through some curiosity training. Like, it's just not a thing. But when I first started and I thought, you know what, this is the thing I'm passionate about. I talk about, my name's Scott. I talk about curiosity and fostering a curiosity mindset. Yeah, well, so what? What for? What's the point? What problem are you solving? And so here, if we separate this and introduce some shades of gray into this, I could have taken that feedback as I shouldn't focus on curiosity because no one cares. Or it could be that I'm just not presenting it well enough. I'm not speaking enough to my audience. Well, which audience? Who am I speaking to? Am I speaking to executive leaders? Am I speaking to middle managers? And so you see, there's this entire spectrum of how do we take an idea, how do we take a philosophy, and then we evolve and we evolve and we evolve all of those to be able to, I guess, do the business, to be able to sell a program or sell a keynote or sell a coaching package. But every step along that way, if we don't get traction, then it's like, oh my God, is it me? Am I the idiot? And so this is sometimes we're going a little bit deeper into it and introducing some of that daylight between all these challenges can have a real big influence on how we think about things. If I just got stuck at that first stage, people don't really want curiosity, then that can be a hit. That can be an emotional gut punch of maybe I'm just full of crap. So that's how my self-doubt has perhaps emerged over my particular journey in building my own personal brand, has just been, do I double down on my belief that this is the thing that I want to address in the world and I've got the skills and I've got the experience, or do I have to change? And every time I change, here's another layer of, well, am I doing the right thing? We're just not sure. So those are some of my experiences with self-doubt.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Scott. I mean, I pick up everything that you're putting down. I really have felt that piece around am I good enough, or are my ideas good enough? And then it's like spawned or triggered a deep dive into personal development to try and upskill and take a bunch of courses so I can somehow reach this standard of being good enough for people to want to invest. And I think that's a really interesting point. If for anyone who's in a service-based business, you are effectively selling a promise of transformation through your ideas, through a consultancy. And so when you put yourself out there and you perhaps don't get the response that you'd like you shared with your own journey, well, maybe my curiosity stuff isn't worth listening to or investing in or hearing. How do you then say, or what helps you shift from maybe I'll just do something completely different to saying, okay, maybe I just need to change my messaging? Because there are lots of people out there, maybe someone who's listening who really believes in their idea, in an innovation, in a product, in a service that they're creating. They get met with some rejection or some resistance, and then they're like, "Oh, well, maybe this isn't for me." So how do you navigate that? How, like, what helps you continue staying loyal to your idea, but navigating perhaps a new avenue?
There are two separate tracks to this. As I'm sure people who listen to us talk and then get to sort of know me a little bit more, you're gonna hear this a lot, right? I'm gonna give you a system side, right? The mind centered side, and then a heart centered side, right? Because a big part of what I talk a lot about these days is being able to blend the two and thinking about the two separately. So the first part, I'll give you the mind centered response, right? Or the brain centered response, whichever one is the current vernacular. It can sometimes be really helpful just to look at what type of lifestyle you want to have. Because if we strip away just everything around business or anything like that, everyone needs some level of income to be able to put a roof over their heads, to put bread on the table, and to be able to start saving for a future, for a lifestyle, or for retirement, or whatever that might be. And so sometimes it can actually be really healthy, I would argue, to just look at your finances and just go, what can I actually sustain? Because so this might sound challenging to very heart-centered people, and I'll throw you a bone in a sec, right? But it can sound very challenging to heart-centered people because often the messaging there is about you just got to follow your passion, follow your purpose. Look at the people who put their heart and soul into everything, and they look at where they got to now. But I'm so mindful of survivorship bias here. We hear stories of people who've done that and succeeded. We don't tend to hear stories of people who put their heart and soul into everything and it didn't succeed, because they're not going to go around broadcasting that to everyone, right? Like if you imagine that someone who spent 5 years building a personal brand and which is about, I don't know, let's say authenticity, and it didn't work. And then they had to go for a job interview. Right? Would they necessarily highlight that they spent 5 years trying to do this thing and didn't work? Like, not necessarily, right? So you don't hear a lot of those stories. So it can be really healthy sometimes just to go, well, what can you actually afford to do? And this is almost like straight up business fundamentals in how we think about things, right? If you start any business, you need some amount of capital to invest into the business to see how long it takes before you can succeed, before you can take off. That's what we call the runway. And capital isn't just money, it's also time and energy. And so you might say, well, I can afford to not have stable income for, say, 1 year. There you go. That's the very brain-centered approach to thinking about, well, how much time can I put into this business before I need to pivot or shift? Okay. So that's just one side. That is just one side. The heart-centered side is then being able to find ways to constantly test, right, and evolve. And there's a difference between being passionate about something and being fixed on how your passion manifests. Because taking for myself, right, I talk a lot about wanting to cultivate curiosity, but I have learned over time that I can't just bang on this point, because if it's not resonating, if I'm not hearing the feedback from people saying, yeah, they actually really appreciated the work that I've done for them, then I have to be able to hold that lightly. It's not that the idea is necessarily bad or my passion is misplaced. It could just be a communication challenge. It's that I've not known how to present what it is that I do. And here, if I can paint a picture for people, or maybe rather carve a sculpture. A sculpture comes from what? Like a block of stone, a block of marble. And what do? We chisel away at it. I think it was Da Vinci who mentioned that sometimes sculpting is about finding and emerging the sculpture that's there. You don't quite know what's in it, but you kind of find where the sculpture is. And sometimes I think this type of work is around that. It's this personal work is around, well, let's find out where the sculpture is. And so that's where these two things come together. It's kind of saying, maybe it's just not presented right yet. Maybe I still haven't found the way that I want to share what it is I want to do. And so it's being able to test that. It's being able to go out and talk to people and feel into it and experiment and hold it lightly. And how long do we have to do that? Well, that's where you go back to the brain-centered side, right? So these two things together, like This is what I mean by saying I don't want to like dump on, passion. It really is passion. And the notion that the people who are successful are very obsessed with their idea. Yeah, they do succeed because they are obsessed. But there is one category of founders and business owners that we in the startup world refer to as the walking dead, which is they're already dead. Like the business is dead. There is no business. But because of their passion, they keep throwing good money after bad. They're not actually adapting. And that's also a problem as well. And I'd argue that the sacrifice there, the long-term sacrifice there can be even more painful, because this is where we get into people who give up their marriage, give up, they remortgage their homes because, oh, you just got to be obsessed. You got to be passionate about it, right? But that's a risk. So that's how I sort of approach this.
For sure, yeah. The sunk cost fallacy can create a lot of unnecessary suffering if you purely are guided by passion and purpose. So I appreciate you talking to that, because there's so much messaging out there that just focuses on that. And I think if you have created a certain level of success with a business, just talking about that can seem really exciting and very inspiring. Absolutely. It certainly would look great on a bumper sticker, follow your passion, but it's very nuanced. Absolutely right. And without taking into account other obligations and lifestyle and dependence, you know, th- it requires having a bit of a plan in place so that you can ensure that it's sustainable and you can still continue following your passion in a safe way without compromising things and letting go of, parts of your life and sacrificing unnecessary things along the way.
I'd love to hear about your journey as well, then, because we've been down this pathway a little bit. We've got some parallels to this work that we do, and you're someone who is very heart centered and heart led in a lot of the work that you do. I'd love to hear your reflection on your journey through like this iteration, emerging the sculpture. What's that been like for you?
Sure. Well, I love the whole analogy of the sculpture, because I do believe that, as cheesy as it may sound, you can have a crack at me in the comments, there is a masterpiece within everyone. I think everyone's lived experience and challenges and adversities have actually set them up for it could be a business or it could be a creative pursuit, right? Or an endeavor or a project or something that, feels meaningful to them. Um, Everyone has the capacity to transform that into something of value to share in the world. And no one, like everyone is so deeply unique. And with the right tools and the right belief, it absolutely is possible for everyone to bring out the masterpiece from within. To carry on the analogy, I think it's about removing what's blocking it. And oftentimes there are a lot of more logistical prefrontal cortex things like communication and messaging and the way that you frame your offering. But also a lot of the time it's fears and doubts and limiting beliefs and like, oh, I don't think anyone has to or wants to listen to what I have to say, or I'm not good enough, or I'm not experienced enough, or, I'm afraid of success and the challenges and the responsibilities that it might bring, which is often a very cunning and subtle and challenging beast to slay along the journey. And it certainly has been that case for me with my business, initially in the mental health space, social enterprise as well. Quite a lot of learning and humility on my part not to associate my worth with the performance of it. And so I think that was one of the clumps of clay that I had to learn to remove, because it created a lot of unnecessary pain along the journey. Because business, like life, like seasons, there are seasons of growth and there are, seasons of flatness and, recalibration and all of that. And I think when I associated my worth to that performance and we weren't doing well, or I had to shut down the business, then it was very painful. So from that perspective, there's definitely a lot of self-development work along the way, but also to use your term, holding the vision, but holding the way in which it manifests lightly, so as to not be married to the outcome. So my mission, broadly speaking, as the name of the podcast suggests, is to really liberate people from unnecessary self-made suffering. And my first business was an attempt at doing that, and it didn't work out, and I learned from it. And now I'm evolving this into a new vehicle to support the world and create value through coaching. And so I'm still staying loyal to that overarching vision, but I'm holding the nuts and bolts of it lightly. And I think that's really important. And maybe I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Maybe it is a rite of passage for entrepreneurs or creators to go through, to acknowledge that, oh, just because this isn't doing well, it doesn't mean it's a reflection of who I am or my worth. An invitation to be a bit more flexible and a bit more dynamic and a bit more resilient. Be interested to hear your thoughts on that, and whether it's possible to cultivate that independently without, before even entering into a venture, or whether, it is a rite of passage that people have to go through to get there.
I think it's a rite of passage, unfortunately. I think that over my experience, I have, especially in the leadership space, in the leadership development space, it is so easy just to say things. It's so easy to say, be vulnerable. It's so easy to say, you should care for people. It's so easy to say, just follow your passions, right? But actually doing those things is a different question. For example, if we just talk about something as simple as authenticity, right? There are going to be times where your authenticity will be used against you. There'll be times where vulnerability can be weaponized against you. And let's say we want to be inclusive of diverse voices. Well, actually doing that means including people who might severely disagree with you. And that's deeply uncomfortable, right? And so actually doing the thing is just different. Anybody who has, for anyone who's listening, right? If you can think of a penny drop moment where you knew something intellectually, right? You knew, for example, what it means to be that you should practice gratitude. And then one day you're just like, oh, damn, I get it now. I get what it means to be grateful for something. That's kind of what I'm talking about. And in a business setting, this is where there is a rite of passage, so to speak. And it's not about saying you have to go through and suffer for it, but it's being able to experience what it means to hustle, right? It means there's nothing that can really prepare a first-time, say, entrepreneur or business owner for those moments in the middle of the night where you wake up and you're just full of doubt. Like, you can intellectually understand what we're talking about, but until you feel it, you don't quite understand. And then to experience what it means to come out the other side of that, you kind of just have to go through it. And this is where, when we get exposed to all this noise on social media, this is where, if we bring a bit of the type of noises that we hear, perhaps as males, as men, which might be a little bit different to what we hear, what women might hear. There's a lot of the male influences, right? That might just be a bit, I mean, there's a couple of categories, of course, but there's like, just go hard, go 10x in, and, look at my Rolex and look at my Lambo and all that type of stuff. And it's that's just a story, right? But you get that impression, oh, why am I not like them, right? And I think men perhaps just on average, as a broad average, have that little bit more of a stoic approach, have a bit of a solo wolf approach, or there's a very competitive alpha kind of an approach. Again, on average, there's always exceptions everywhere. But that's where those are some of the things that can factor in, right? I think for me, going through some of those processes, I think there's been dark nights, right? I think what really helped for me has been having a good community of people to help me work through those things. There's friends that I can pick up the phone and I'm just like, I feel terrible. I feel like I'm lost. I feel like I'm trying to boil the ocean with everything that I do, and I don't really know what I'm supposed to do next. I think I'm still passionate about this thing that I'm doing, but no one's picking up the phone and no one's calling me. No one's asking me for work. Like, is it me? These are things that are really hard to work through, and everyone's going to respond quite differently. And this comes down to personality types and that type of stuff. Like, speaking for myself, I on the big five personality traits, right? The ocean traits, my level of neuroticism is quite low, right? So how I respond to stress is going to be different to how other people respond to stress. Like I bounce back quite quickly. I can not so much compartmentalize, but I can observe my stress as an emotion and just ride with it as a fellow companion, right? So it's not something that I have to kind of remove or hide or whatever that is. And I'm not always successful either, but others may go through something a little bit different.
Thank you so much for talking about those dark nights that no one prepares you for. What immediately dropped in was my own experience when I was in India. I was exploring opportunities for global expansion and meeting with potential partners and investors. Meanwhile, the business was encountering a lot of resourcing challenges and legal challenges. And I was wrestling with the really uncomfortable truth that I would have to let people go, wind things up. And yeah, I had like a massive crisis, both emotionally and mentally. And I ended up falling very, very ill in the hotel room, crying my eyes out and wondering how the fuck did I get here and how the fuck am I going to get out of here? Because yeah, I deeply, deeply uncomfortable, deeply unsettling. And so I,
And this is exactly it, right?
yeah.
Like you knew beforehand, right? Just in via osmosis of information absorption, right? Going through, you're doing a mental health service, right? You understand some of these challenges that people go through, and yet you were still like crashing out in a hotel. And this is exactly what I mean by there's sometimes nothing is really going to prepare you for that experience. That's very much the heart side. You could intellectually understand there's going to be challenges, but how you handle those challenges emotionally is a completely different thing.
For sure. Yeah. I think it would be an exercise in futility to try and prepare someone for that intellectually because you've not developed the emotional thick skin and emotional resilience and the character to deal with it and prepare yourself for future events. And I think, I mean, I can look back on it now and, hindsight's a blessing because I can see it for what that experience really was, which was to set me up for what I'm doing now and to offer the challenges as little nuggets of wisdom of how to surround myself with the right people and to um, have important strategies in place to look after my well-being and not give in to the toxic hustle culture that exists out there that you're talking about. So since you talked about your own experience and how you've dealt with the dark nights, maybe we can double click on that. Like, I know you mentioned you've reached out to friends and you've got an awareness that you're not your stress. Can you perhaps talk more to that? So if there's someone who's listening out there who might be going through one of those dark nights of the soul or experiencing a real crisis, what's your strategy for pulling yourself out of it?
I think these days I don't really like to think of it as pulling myself out of it. I think where I am these days is recognizing that it's just going to happen. The dark nights are just going to happen. That the high highs and the low lows, they're just a part of life, right? It's not to get too cliched about it, but it is the journey, right? I mean, even reflecting on, your story just then, you were able to look back in hindsight and see that experience for what it is, for the learning experience for what it is. However, do you know if you're really on the right path now? Right? In 5 years' time, you might look back at this conversation and go, actually, I still wasn't quite there yet. We never know, right? And that's not to say that you're not wrong in the path that you're on right now. But I think it's important to contextualize that this is life journey, right? This
Mm.
is what it means to kind of go through life. And so these days, I almost kind of reject or push back against this notion of, achieving things like happiness or fulfillment or balance or whatever it is, because I think it's a matter of perspective. So, for example, if we play on that language, how did I pull myself out of stress? Well, within that, there's an inference that there's a level to get back to. There's like a
Mm.
bar, and I'm dipping below the bar, right? So I've got to do things to get back to a bar, right? Or you can replace that bar of stress with, say, happiness. If I
Mm.
do these things, I'll be happy, right? But as you know, and as people who've talked a lot about happiness knows, happiness is not just something you go out and just get, right? It's often an outcome of what it is that we do. And so for me, I really like to go with the emotion these days. So being part of imagining the ocean, there are crests, there are, high points, and then there's low points. And I'm not seeking a flat ocean. I am the ocean, right?
Mm.
There'll be times where I will be in a lull and there'll be times where I'll be in a crest. And making peace with that has what helped me manage some of this stress, right? And I'll just say to my friends, I'm just going through a low phase at the moment, right? It means I'll probably show up a little bit slower. Like I recognize the signs and symptoms that come along to it. I don't try and push myself out of it. Maybe I might treat myself to some KFC, right? And just go, yeah, I know it's not the healthiest thing and but I just go with it, right? And because I can go with it, I think that's probably the reason why I can bounce out of it more quickly. Because imagine if I don't imagine there's a bar that I'm trying to reach for and I don't get there. Well, that's one more thing that I suck at.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? Like,
Mm.
especially for people who are in a self-development type of space, if you just do these things, you'll be happier. If you do those things and you're not happy, right?
One more thing to beat myself up about.
Exactly it.
Mm.
Exactly it.
Yeah.
So I think that for me is a bit of that strategy. And so it's less, I think. So if I had to be really practical about the advice, right, my strategy for this, half of it is sometimes getting quite systems about it, right? Because sometimes we're in that high stress mode or that low point of the night, we're very in the heart space, right? In the emotional space. Okay, inject a bit of hardness into it. How do I have a roof over my head? Yes, I do. Do I have some money in the bank? Yeah, I do. Right? I can afford to do this. Can I get another job somewhere? Yeah, I can. Right? So here we've got some very clear, tangible actions that people can do. Right? And so that creates a reference point and a
Mm.
clear reference point. Right? Emotionally, it might be about finding people who can just be someone that runs alongside you. Right? Just says, yeah, sucks that you're going through a low phase at the moment. Let me know if you just want to hang. If anything, I say just potentially be wary of people who might say, you know what you should do? You should go do some meditation, right? You should just do some of this, or you should just do some of that. Because that's that thing where, again, if you follow their recommendation and it doesn't work for you, then you're gonna feel like you suck at another thing. So you just be mindful of that. And then this is where, again, this is where social media starts to have a really bad influence, because you look at that and it's so easy. Everyone's just got, I just did this thing and I got out of my stress. We know that this is a facade. I'm not doubting that some people can get out of stress that way, but we know that it is usually the really positive messages that are presented on something like social media. So yeah, so those are some of the strategies that I've deployed. What about you?
I love the notion of riding with the emotion and not trying to fight it. I mean, as the old adage goes, whatever you resist persists. So if I'm experiencing a certain level of stress and I'm trying to rail against it and trying as hard as I possibly can to fight it or overcome it or combat it or pull myself out of it, I end up making my situation worse. So actually, letting it take me wherever it wants to take me, being curious about what it's trying to teach me as well. Maybe it is gratitude, right? And I'm really glad that you spoke about that. Is certainly talked about liberally in the personal growth space. I think for good reason though, because I can only speak from my experience, but my journey has gone through a number of phases where I understood gratitude and I journaled 5 things I'm grateful for each day. But then when my Nando's from Uber Eats arrived without my peri peri chips, I wasn't very grateful. I started, verbally assaulting the Uber Eats support team. I want my chips. I want my refund. I was like, what the fuck am I doing? I'm not grateful at all. I'm not grateful for the fact that I could search for whatever food I wanted and it was delivered to me within 20 minutes. And I got to sit down and, watch The Office while like devouring a Supremo wrap. And so that's super important to talk about. And I think my journey I've certainly benefited from letting the stress take me as deep as it needed to perhaps encounter sides of myself that I haven't acknowledged or embraced. For instance, I remember going through a phase, I think it was a few years ago, where I was doing a lot of business development, meeting with prospective clients, and then they weren't signing up. And I made that mean that I'm somehow not good enough. And I then sat with it, and it happened, I think, 4 or 5 times in a row. And then I just felt really, really sad. I felt really sad, especially coming to your point back before around, does this mean that I'm not good enough, or I'm an idiot, or my ideas aren't good, or I need to be better? And I was feeling really down and out, and my dad asked me, because I was staying with him at the time. He's like, "What's going on?" He could tell that something was wrong with me. And historically, I've never really had or felt. I guess I've never felt a deep, meaningful emotional connection with my dad. And it's a byproduct of conditioning and culture around being stoic, like you're saying before, keeping one's cards close to one's chest. And so that's something that I've worked on over many years. And so when he asked me, there was a bit of hesitance, but I opened up to him, and then I started sobbing. And then he told me, "Dave, you're doing great. And I'm really proud of you." And I don't think I'd heard that from my dad, at least not in a very long time. And it was really interesting because I felt like those series of rejections almost set me up, at least I believe is how I'm choosing to see the situation. Those rejections set me up, or redirections, set me up to have this conversation with my dad and to remember that he actually is proud of me, and that I am good enough when historically I never felt good enough in the eyes of my dad. So that's, I think, yeah, in many ways what's helped me riding the wave of that emotion, and being super discerning and selective about who I surround myself with on this journey. Because, like you pointed out before as well, like you can have friends, colleagues, acquaintances that say, yeah, you got to meditate, or you got to go for a run, you got to work out, you got to do X, Y, and Z, and almost offer unsolicited advice. It's great if it works for them, but if it doesn't work for you, then you can again make that mean that you're doing it wrong. I'm not meditating right, or whatever it is. And that's why I'd be interested to hear your thoughts as well around what would a really supportive, nourishing, uplifting comrade or companion along this journey look like?
Hmm. I don't know if there could be a single comrade. I think it is helpful to have a few different people in that. And this is where there's perhaps a useful lesson to learn um, from women, right? Who, again, on average, tend to have more of a social sphere. And so there's different people to talk to. I think in terms of having people alongside the types of comrades, there's a few here. There are ones who are able to just hold the space and can just run alongside you without offering advice. But equally, there can be ones who are more like the sports coach, right? Like, go on, get over it, pull yourself together. And it's going to be different for each person. And the reason I sort of say it that way is because there have been times where the really supportive friend was essentially practicing a form of ruinous empathy, right? No, you're amazing. Your ideas are fantastic, right? But really, what if they're not? What if actually you do need a bit of a shift or pivot in the way that you think? Right. So being told that you're good when you may actually need to improve is not always helpful. Right. But people aren't always ready to hear that. Okay. So I'm cautious about how strongly I make a claim on that. And other times, like it really is beneficial to have someone challenge you. There's ones that can challenge you, there's ones that can push you, and there's ones that can walk alongside you. And I think all of this are really helpful to have.
What's the difference between challenge and push?
Is like, in my I guess, way of thinking about it, push is kind of like the whole, come on, let's go do it, let's go do it. Like, let's push each other, right? Challenge is more, yeah, yeah. Are you sure you're doing this right? Like, is there something that you're not considering, right? So in the leadership development world, we often call this a provocation, right? So it's deliberately turning up the heat, right? To sort of say, yeah, I am going to cook you a little bit. I'm gonna challenge your thinking on this, right? Because imagine I say this in a very, imagine I deliver this in a very heart-centered way, right? But it's sort of saying, look, I love what you're doing. However, I'm seeing you kind of going around the same circles again and again. So I want to challenge you. Are you just going over the same ground? What are you not doing? Right. And that can be confronting for some people to hear, but perhaps that actually is the thing that you need. Right. And so this, hence my concern, not concern, but like, hence that tiny little like amber light about saying, just hang around with people who are your tribe, who will push you, because sometimes the insight that you need may not come from here.
100%. 100%. I think there are degrees of pushing that I think are important to touch on. And I kind of want to bring it back to what you were talking about before, just around the notion that exists out there that is certainly perpetuated by a lot of the Rolex sporting, Lambo driving, Navy SEAL mentality, quote unquote gurus or experts that are harking and promoting the idea of pushing harder and hustling harder. So I want to hear from you, especially through your lens as an entrepreneur and also someone that's worked and works in the leadership development space. At what point does pushing become toxic? At what point does pushing turn into really unproductive and possibly even harmful approach?
I think mileage varies is probably the answer. And this is where, when I talk a lot about curiosity and getting people to be a bit more curious about the world, it's what I'm really trying to say is to ask people to hold their conceptions a little bit more lightly and hold their ideas a bit more lightly, right? I don't know when too much is too much. Only it's down to the individual, right? I'm certainly not going to sort of sit here and say that I've got that figured out. But maybe my constitution is a little bit different to others. Maybe I can push harder than others. And so that's what I sort of need. I mean, some of this ties into love languages as well. Some people really respond well to treats. Some people respond well to acts of service. Different people respond well. There's all sort of different variations, right? I think the risk is always when you pick one and only one. So for the person who's only listening to, like, I don't know, the Dave Goggins of the world, it's like, well, maybe it's worth listening to some of the Esther Perels or, the Brené Browns and leading with heart. But equally, for people who just listen to Brené Brown, maybe it's helpful to sometimes listen to a little bit of the Dave Goggins, right? So I think there is never one single answer, especially in the heart space. Heck, even in the brain space, there's never one single answer, right? But especially in the heart space, which is very subjective and is emotionally subjective for a lot of different people, that it's important to be open to different approaches and to be able to try different things, right? Because too much, sometimes it's a bit like doing physical training, right? Sometimes you're like, I don't know if I could run this marathon. And then you do. And all of a sudden, you realize you've broken through to a new plateau. And that's powerful. But that's a physical example. So emotionally, it could be the same thing, right? So from a heart-centered perspective, I didn't realize that my vulnerability marathon makes me show up in a different way, right? So I think this is a part of that journey. Like we don't know, but that's why it's useful to be open and useful to sort of consider different approaches to it. And only you can know. But that's why it's kind of good to have a few different comrades, right? To be able to test different things on and to have different voices come in and to have this lens of curiosity, not just reflect outwards, but reflect inwards as well.
100%. And yeah, I think to your point around staying open-minded to different teachers and sources of inspiration is important. And the way I look at it is it's kind of combining a masculine and a feminine approach. It has nothing to do with gender. It's like a yin and yang or structure versus flow kind of approach where masculine might be more action taking and feminine might be more receiving. And if you have too much of one energy, can tip the scales in one direction. You end up either burning yourself out or getting really flustered because nothing's happening and you're not creating enough activity out in the world. And so I, yeah, I think to whoever's listening, it's about finding a balance that works for you so that you can assess when you might have fallen out of balance and off kilter to introduce one approach versus the other. And so I want to perhaps start bringing this in for a landing and hear from you, Scott, just around your approach with curiosity. I want to tie it back to what we first spoke about, and I've, I guess, explored throughout this episode as it relates to self-doubt and how that manifests and how to navigate that and reinstill some confidence and belief in oneself. Taking a curiosity mindset approach. Okay. If you've got someone who's sitting in front of you right now who might be listening, who may be a professional or a manager in the workplace, and they're really doubting their ability. They're doubting their ability to lead their team. They're doubting their ability to perform and meet specific quotas or KPIs and to report back to the leadership team with confidence. Taking a curiosity mindset approach, what would you say to them?
I would say, well, firstly, I really like that you referenced the yin and yang before, because that is in many ways very central to my motif and sort of how I think about practicing curiosity, right? In every heart-centered approach, there has to be a bit of a brain. And in every brain-centered approach, there has to be a bit of heart. Let me translate that even further, right? In every leadership component, where often that's a soft skill thing, there has to be a bit of management, right? And vice versa. With discomfort, I sometimes think of it this way. I have a slightly different interpretation of it, right? So if we think about comfort, why are we comfortable at all? What's a comfort zone? We're comfortable because we're familiar with it. We know what's going to happen. So when you step out of that comfort zone, well, we're doing something that's new. For example, I'm leading a team for the first time. Of course, it's going to be new. Of course, it's going to be uncomfortable, right? Because we are now going outside of this boundary, right? Or the zone of comfort. And so we have to navigate that, right? And then in going back to your previous point about like pushing, right? Sometimes that push is to get into a discomfort zone because that's how we then level up, so to speak. And which is why if it goes too far in the other direction, or it's like, no, don't do anything that might challenge you. Well, that just means you're kind of going to be in your comfort zone constantly. And there's no real opportunity for growth there. Of course, the downside is if you go way too far and you can't find your way back to the comfort zone, you will die out in the desert of discomfort. I should trademark that.
Yeah.
So the curiosity mindset approach is really about an ongoing cycle, right? I go back to that journey description that I had before. And if you think about, let's say something like your gratitude example, you wrote down in your gratitude journal a few things and you practiced a bit of gratitude. And then you realize you had a Nando's experience and you lost your gratitude, right? But over time, your ability to practice gratitude gets better. You did demonstrate gratitude, but maybe you only demonstrated level 1 gratitude. So as you experience that bit of discomfort and you reflected on that, the next time you start to practice level 2 discomfort. And that's kind of how I think about a lot of this work that we do. You know, everything we've talked about, the ebbs and flows, the ups and downs. Now take all of that and think about it as a spiral staircase, right? Half the staircase is inside a building, your safe zone, and half the staircase is outside the building with no scaffolding on it, right? Every time you climb it, each time you climb it to a new level, you build a set of scaffolding so the levels below become safer, right? But if you picture it like this, then for this manager who is stepping into this new role, it's, yeah, by working through this, right? Like you are going to be uncomfortable. There is no world in which you do something new and you're not comfortable with it. But discomfort is where you learn. And so hold all these things lightly, right? If you're emotionally really charged about it, let's bring a bit of the structure into it. Think about the things that just treat it as work, get objective. But if it's very objective and it's too technical and you're like overwhelmed with just the sheer workload, bring a bit of heart into it How do you really feel about it? Like, why do you have to do all these things, right? Every time you practice that, you get a little bit better at it. And that is the process, right? And it's really, really hard to see this. But this is that point of the baptism of fire, the rite of passage. Going through your business, you went through level 1 of the rite of passage, or level 2 or level 3. And it's an endless cycling, right? And so overcoming things, going all the way back, overcoming things like self-doubt, that type of stuff, that's the journey. For anyone who's listening, maybe this is the exercise. Think back to when you were a bit younger and the thing that you were doubtful about when you were younger and how comfortable it feels now. Just plot a line between those things and realize the things that you were doubtful about before, you are no longer doubtful about. And so if you're feeling self-doubt now, you can project a trend line into the future where you can look back at this point in time and go, what was I so doubtful of, right? The practice of curiosity will help overcome some of these things.
I love that. That's such a helpful frame. And I think as soon as you mentioned that, what immediately, where I was immediately transported to was, I was like 12 and I was doing Taekwondo and it was my first time in a fight and old mate kicks me in the head from the get go. And I'm like, man, I really suck at this. Wincing in pain. I'm really not good enough. And then, I managed to work my way up to black belt and I was the one kicking people's heads. So the self-doubt 100% is part of the journey. And I love the whole spiral staircase frame as well, because then I feel like what that does is it prepares people to expect the self-doubt to creep in and to acknowledge that it is teaching you a very important lesson. And it's kind of helping you develop the mental and emotional and logistical and strategic scaffolding so that you can get to that next level. So thank you for sharing that, Scott. Where can people find out more about you?
I'm pretty easy to find. You can just check out my website, scottco.com. That's co with a K. And you can find me on all the socials at the Scott Co.
Awesome. Scott, thank you so much. I have one more final question before we wrap up. What does it mean to be liberated in your eyes?
Being liberated is being able to accept the agency and the power to be able to chart your own course into the sea of uncertainty. But it's also accepting the highs and lows that come along with that. So being liberated means that you're not playing to someone else's tune. You're going to create your own music, but you're going to have to deal with that fact that sometimes that music's going to be great and sometimes that music is going to be terrible. But it's the fact that you're the one that created it.
Whew, mic drop. That was awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Scott. And thank you for listening. Really appreciate you being here with us. If you found something valuable from Scott's many nuggets of wisdom, please share this episode along to someone who you feel might benefit. And I'll see you in the next episode.